He buried her 20 years ago. Tonight, across a crowded room, he was about to see her breathe. Her face hadn't changed as much as he expected. 20 years of grief, and there she was, alive. For 20 years, he told his daughter her mother was gone. Beside his dead wife stood a young woman with his exact eyes. He had never met her in his life.
Michael Turner had buried his wife 20 years ago. He had stood at her graveside in the rain with a 6-month-old daughter in his arms, and he had believed, with the kind of certainty that only grief can manufacture, that he would never see her face again. Tonight, across a crowded hospital charity gala, he was looking directly at her hero, alive, breathing, laughing softly at something the young woman beside her had just said. Truly stays buried, or whether some secrets are simply waiting for the right moment to resurface, stay with this story until the end. And if stories about buried truths, unbreakable love, and the families we build out of what's left behind matter to you, hit like and subscribe now, because this story is only just beginning. 20 years earlier, Michael and Claire Turner had been the kind of young couple everyone assumed would grow old together without incident. High school sweethearts, married at 24, expecting their first child within 2 years of the wedding. Claire had worked as a pediatric nurse at Riverside General, the same hospital hosting tonight's charity gala, and Michael had been finishing his degree in structural engineering, working nights at a hardware store to help cover their small apartment's rent. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And when their daughter, whom they named Ava, was born, they had believed, in the naive and beautiful way new parents always do, that the hardest part of their lives was already behind them. It wasn't. 6 months after Ava was born, Claire's older brother, Daniel Voss, resurfaced in their lives after nearly a decade of estrangement. Older, harder, and deeply entangled with a group of men Claire recognized immediately as dangerous. The kind of people who didn't ask for favors so much as demand them and disappear when things went wrong. Daniel had gotten involved in something he refused to fully explain, something involving stolen shipment routes and a man named Renner, who ran half the illegal freight moving through the docks on the east side of the city. When Daniel showed up at their apartment one night, frightened and bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, begging Claire to hide something for him just for a few days, Claire had made the decision that would define the next 20 years of her life. She said yes, because he was her brother, and because she didn't yet understand what she was truly agreeing to protect. What Daniel left with her, hidden in an old shoebox at the back of their closet, wasn't money or drugs, as Claire had feared. It was a set of financial records, meticulous, damning documentation of exactly how Renner's organization moved money through 3 legitimate-looking shipping companies, records Daniel had stolen in a moment of guilt-ridden panic after realizing how deep he'd gotten and how badly he wanted out. Within days, men Claire had never seen before began watching their apartment building. A car with tinted windows sat outside for 6 straight hours one Tuesday. A note, unsigned, was slipped under their door that simply read, "We know what your brother took. Give it back, or we take something of yours instead." Claire understood, with a cold and immediate clarity, exactly what something of yours meant, sitting 6 months old and sleeping peacefully in the next room. She didn't tell Michael everything at first. She told him enough to convince him they needed to leave town for a while, staying with a cousin 2 states away for safety, and Michael, trusting his wife completely, agreed without a second thought. It was during those 3 tense weeks away that Claire discovered something that changed everything again. She was pregnant, unexpectedly, with a second child. Twins had never been mentioned by any doctor, because Ava, it turned out, had been one of a set, and her sister had simply developed more slowly, hidden and undetected. In early scans, only now becoming clear in Claire's rapidly changing body months after Ava's birth. It was an exceedingly rare, almost unheard-of case of superfetation that Claire's new doctor gently explained was documented in medical literature, but almost never seen in practice. Claire had conceived a second child weeks after Ava, the pregnancies overlapping instead of simultaneous, which was the only reason it hadn't been caught on the original ultrasounds. Claire made a decision in those 3 weeks that she would carry, in silence for the next 2 decades. A federal investigator working a related organized crime case against Renner's operation approached Claire quietly through the cousin's connections, having heard through informants that she was holding evidence critical to a case that had been building for years. The investigator, a careful, serious woman named Agent Patricia Coyle, explained that if Claire testified and handed over the financial records, she could bring down an operation responsible for years of trafficking and violence, but it would mean full witness protection, an entirely new identity, and complete, permanent separation from anyone who might be used as leverage against her, including, devastatingly, her own husband and daughter, at least for as long as the threat against them remained active. Claire made the hardest decision of her life in a cramped motel room 2 states from home, staring at an ultrasound photo of a second daughter nobody else yet knew existed. She couldn't protect 2 infants in hiding while testifying against a man like Renner. She couldn't ask Michael to disappear into witness protection with her, uprooting Ava's entire life on the promise of a danger he didn't fully understand and a threat that could take years to resolve. So she made a choice that broke her heart in a way she never fully recovered from. She left Ava with Michael, told him a devastating, fabricated story about a fatal car accident on her drive back from the cousin's house, arranged through Agent Coyle for a body and death certificate that would hold up under any grieving husband's scrutiny, and disappeared into protective custody, carrying a second daughter Michael never knew existed, to testify against Renner's organization and dismantle it from the inside over the following 2 years. Michael buried an empty casket, raised his daughter alone through every skinned knee, every school play, every heartbreak and triumph a father walks through with a child, believing completely that Claire was gone. He never remarried, not because he swore some dramatic vow of loneliness, but because no one else ever quite fit into the space Claire had left, and because Ava filled most of what remained of his heart anyway. Ava grew up knowing her mother only through photographs and the soft, careful way her father spoke of her, never bitter, always gentle, always making sure Ava understood she had been loved completely, even if only briefly. Claire, under a new identity in a small coastal town 4 states away, raised her second daughter, whom she named Vera, in a life built entirely around secrecy and distance. The trial against Renner concluded successfully 7 years after it began, delayed repeatedly by appeals, additional indictments, and the slow grinding machinery of federal prosecution, But by the time Renner and his top lieutenants were finally imprisoned, and the danger against Claire's family was declared over, so much time had passed that Claire found herself frozen by a different kind of fear entirely, not the fear of violence, but the fear of walking back into a life she had already, technically, ended. How does a woman explain to the husband she let grieve her death for years that she was alive the entire time? How does she explain to a daughter she abandoned as an infant and a daughter she raised in hiding why their entire existence had been built on a lie neither of them chose? So Claire didn't go back. She told herself year after year that too much time had passed, that Michael had surely moved on, that Ava had surely healed, that reopening a wound that old would only cause more damage than staying silent ever could. She built a quiet life for herself and Vera in that coastal town, became a hospice nurse, ironically spending her career helping other families face the kind of loss she herself had faked 2 decades earlier. Vera grew up believing her father had died before she was born, a story Claire told with the same practiced, devastating precision she'd once used to convince Michael of her own death, understanding with a bitter kind of clarity exactly how effective a good lie could be. It was Agent Coyle, now retired and unexpectedly reconnecting with Claire after all these years, who finally pushed Claire toward the truth. Coyle had followed Michael's life from a professional distance over the years, partly out of guilt for the role she'd played in orchestrating Claire's disappearance, and mentioned almost in passing during a visit that Michael had become a well-respected structural engineer who now served on the board of Riverside General's Charity Foundation, the same hospital where Claire had once worked, the same hospital hosting its annual gala fundraiser that very month. Coyle didn't push Claire to attend. She simply mentioned it and let the 20-year weight of the decision sit in Claire's hands the way it always had. Claire told herself she was only going to observe, quietly from a distance, just to see how Michael's life had turned out, just to finally have some closure after 2 decades of wondering. She brought Vera along, telling her only that they were attending a charity event for a hospital her mother used to work at, nothing more. She never expected Michael to actually see her. She never expected, standing near the gala's window with Vera beside her, to look up and find Michael Turner, older now, gray threading through his hair, but unmistakably, achingly himself a Euro, standing perfectly still across the crowded room, staring directly at her. Michael felt the entire gala fall away around him. 20 years of careful, hard-won grief cracked open in the span of a single held breath. He set down his glass of water without looking at it, and he began walking, slowly, deliberately, through the crowd toward a woman he had mourned for 2 decades, and a young woman beside her whose green eyes, even from across the room, were unmistakably, impossibly his own. "Claire," he said when he finally reached her, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with 2 decades of unresolved grief compressed into a single syllable. Claire's composure, carefully maintained through years of hospice work and hard-earned emotional distance, finally broke completely. "Michael," she said, and then, because there was truly no gentle way to say what came next, "This is Vera. She's your daughter." The gala noise around them seemed to fade into a distant hum as Michael looked, for the first time in his life, at his second daughter, a Euro, 20 years old, dark-haired, with his own green eyes staring back at him in stunned, equally overwhelmed confusion, because Claire had never told Vera the full truth either, only that her father had died before she was born, not that he was standing 30 feet away at a hospital charity gala with tears already gathering in his eyes. What followed over the next several hours, moved into a quiet side room away from the gala's curious glances, was not a single conversation, but an unraveling of 20 years Euro Claire explaining Daniel's desperate mistake, the threat against their family, the impossible decision she'd made in a motel room with an ultrasound photo of a second daughter nobody yet knew existed, the trial, the years of hiding, the slow accumulation of fear that had kept her silent long after the danger had passed. Michael listened, his anger and grief and disbelief tangled together in ways he couldn't fully separate, but underneath all of it sat something he hadn't expected to feel, relief, fierce and overwhelming, that Claire had never actually died, that some version of the family he'd lost had impossibly survived somewhere else this entire time. Ava, called and asked to come to the hospital that same night without being told why, walked into that quiet side room expecting some kind of medical emergency involving her father, and instead found herself face to face with the mother she had spent 20 years knowing only through photographs, standing beside a young woman who looked enough like Ava herself, a Euro, same dark hair, same stubborn set to the jaw, though Vera's eyes were unmistakably their father's, a Euro, that the resemblance alone answered questions Ava hadn't even known to ask yet. "You're my sister," Ava said slowly, staring at Vera, and the sheer, dizzying strangeness of speaking. That sentence out loud for the first time in her life settled over the room like something physical. "I think I am," Vera said, her voice shaking slightly, and for a long moment, the two young women simply stared at each other, 20 years of separate lives suddenly, irrevocably intersecting. The following months were not simple. There was no easy, tidy reconciliation, no single dramatic scene that fixed 2 decades of loss and secrecy overnight. Michael and Claire spent countless difficult conversations working through grief, anger, guilt, and the complicated, unresolved love that had never actually gone away on either side, even through 20 years of separation. Ava needed time to process not just gaining a mother back, but gaining an entire sister she'd never known existed, and to work through her own complicated grief for the childhood she'd had without either of them. Vera needed time to grieve the father she'd been told was dead her entire life, even as she was impossibly getting the chance to know him now, but slowly, deliberately, the way real healing actually happens rather than the way it's often portrayed. The Turner family began rebuilding itself around a truth none of them had chosen, but all of them eventually chose to move forward from. Michael and Claire didn't simply pick up where they'd left off 20 years earlier. A Euro, too much had happened. Too many years had passed, and both of them had changed too much for that. But they built something new together, a careful, honest friendship first, co-parenting 2 adult daughters who were only now learning to be sisters, slowly finding their way toward whatever came next without rushing toward an ending neither of them fully trusted yet. Ava and Vera, though, found something simpler and more immediate. A Euro, an instant, fierce sisterhood that neither of them had known they were missing until they finally had it, spending weekends together comparing the strange parallel lives they'd lived a state apart, discovering shared mannerisms neither of them could explain except through shared blood, laughing at the impossible statistical rarity of their own existence as they slowly filled in 20 years of missing context for each other. A year after that charity gala, Michael stood at another hospital fundraiser, this time with his entire family present for the first time in 2 decades. A year Claire beside him, not yet quite what they used to be but no longer strangers either, and both of his daughters standing together, sharing an easy laugh about something only they understood. He thought, watching them, about the empty casket he had once buried, about 20 years of careful, quiet grief, and about how strange and beautiful it was that some things believed permanently lost could, against every reasonable expectation, find their way back. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this: the past doesn't always stay buried, and sometimes the truths we're most afraid to face are the very things capable of making us whole again. Grief and hope can occupy the same heart at once, and sometimes the family you thought you'd lost forever is simply waiting, quietly, for the right moment to come home. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories like this one, because there are so many more journeys of buried truth, unbreakable love, and families finding their way back to each other still waiting to be told.